Today, we are recording another episode of the CogniVerse. It is a series where we're speaking to thought leaders in the space of technology, but not only technology, neurodiversity, and how we can create more of an inclusive environment and just generally a better working environment for all. And so I have our fifth guest, which is super exciting. Would you mind introducing yourself and a bit about what you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, my name is Thibault, Thibault Messemacre. I'm basically French, but I moved in the UK about 5-6 years ago. I'm now chief of staff for an AI company called Sienna AI. I joined them only a few months ago. What we do is that we build custom LLMs for brands to automate specific tasks. At the minute, we're focusing on customer service automation a lot. My first kind of experience with neurodivergence, especially more as a kind of an advocate, was in my previous company, Dice. It's a London-based startup for live entertainment ticketing and music in general. So as soon as I joined, I really felt there was the space for me to kind of create an employee community group. The diversity, equity, and inclusion team was very active at the time there, and that was my first experience. I created what I thought would just be kind of almost like a club, and after a year, we were already about 30, and a lot of women as well.
Amazing.
So yeah, so I found out that basically there was much more than just an inkling, really, that there could be people like me. And I feel especially at the time, it was in creative industries. It was really impressive, the number of people who just came about just a couple of months when the group was actually active. And now I've left that company, and it's two women that are actually still leading the group in the US and in the UK. So yeah, that was my first kind of experience trying to advocate for the field of neurodivergence and neurodiversity. I'm autistic and I have ADHD, and it's been a lifelong journey, I think. Because it's been we can talk about it more in details, but so far I'm very happy at work and can really be my true self, but I know it's not the case for everyone. So I hope our conversation today can help people understand that it only takes the right environment and a few conversations sometimes to let people kind of be happier at work or be more like themselves.
Yeah, totally. I think it's so important as well. Everyone takes their own time to get to a point where they want to speak openly about neurodiversity. And I think it's also just really powerful seeing someone be able to open up and it is hard, it is difficult to talk about, it's really personal. So yeah, exactly, that's kind of the aim of the game with this series, is just trying to make everything as open and inclusive as possible. And I did have some questions that I prepared prior, because I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything that I wanted to talk to you about. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just go through the questions today that I was keen to ask you, if you don't mind, and then we can just kind of converse from there and see how we go. But I think I tried to be as brief as possible. Otherwise, we'd be here all day asking you all these questions.
Yeah, no worries.
But thanks for the intro. So my first question was, how can neuro accessibility positively impact the user experience for a broader audience? And then on top of that, as an employer yourself, what steps can employers take to sort of prioritize neurodiverse perspectives, I guess, in sort of the product development side of things in tech?
Yeah, I think something that's already quite complex to tackle is that neurodiversity is diverse, and it's really hard to pinpoint, I think, what special needs there might be aspect of building. But the reality is that actually I think the answer is in the second part of that question, where it needs to start from the employer and at large, like the industry and the community, trying to foster those teams and ensuring that diversity is really like at the forefront. So I think if you try to simplify this, right now, like I'm fortunate enough after like spending some time like growing in my career to finally being able to make decisions around sourcing and to actually coach the team, I think, in the right direction in terms of like how do we want to kind of constitute the people who we work with, and the people who actually like come up with our products, so product teams, engineering teams, but research and development at large. And that means like as soon as possible for employers to actually like surround themselves with professionals who are trained on sourcing diverse talent, because it takes effort, it takes knowledge, it takes a network. And now, like, fortunately, some of the companies I work for had that kind of like part covered, and I've seen the true aspect of working with really strong DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion teams, especially as part of the sourcing and talent teams. But it's also something you need to maintain as part of your people team. And that's a skill. Like, that's not something you can make up, especially if you're a scrappy or like a growing startup. It's something you need to kind of like ensure you tick. That means hiring people who value this. And I think it wouldn't be, I mean, I think everybody, I mean, at least people in our community now have seen the value of building through a lens of diversity, that resulting into like products that are just like more compelling for the outside world, but also are just like in general like stronger because they haven't been built by just like people who look the same. So yeah, that I think it's a win-win situation, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree, actually. And I think it's something that I always try, similar to what you were saying, when I'm speaking to particularly startups, because it is that environment where it's quick, it's fast paced. You know, we can't take time thinking about strategy over everything. That's kind of what people perceive with startups. And I think something I always definitely say when I'm talking to a really early age startup is, it's much harder to become diverse later down the line. You have to have that mindset from the get-go.
Yeah.
Because it is, however way you look at it, it can be so off-putting if you have already a pre-existing team that all think the same or kind of look the same. It just kind of can make you feel intimidated. So it does have to be a first sort of thought when you are growing. You do have to be kind of very mindful of that from the get-go, yeah. I think, because you will pay later.
Yeah. I have a very quick anecdote. Like, what really led me to kind of like that journey of being more like outspoken about my autism, ADHD, has really started with a tick box. That's how funny it is. It's like when applying to the role that led me to creating like that first group, it was just like a box that was asking me, do you identify as neurodivergent? You know, that was something as simple as that as part of the recruitment process. And it gave me like the freedom and the safety, the psychological safety actually, to, as part of that company, to be like, oh, maybe I can make a difference. And I created the group from scratch. Just because and when I talked to the recruitment team, they told us that they didn't know how to approach it, but they started with just they saw that some competitors were doing it as well. And they're like, you know what, we're going to start like kind of, grabbing that data, understanding exactly what our workbox looks like. You don't have to basically like go like have like the bells and whistles right at the beginning when it comes to inclusivity. Sometimes you just start with just like the equivalent of like giving a handout, and that's what it looks like sometimes.
Totally, yeah. I think even if you don't know exactly how to maneuver in that situation, just that initial olive branch of saying,
that's it. Yeah.
You know, we want to be better, we want to learn, and we want to evolve. That just already sets the tone of such a, like we said, it's just inclusive, and that's what we all want, really.
Yeah. I think with like any topic that's related to kind of like, protected characteristics, as like people and HR teams call them, which sounds a bit formal. I have noticed when I started kind of like being more involved into these topics at work, how much there was always a fine line between the happy, smiley, empowering, refreshing form of like advocacy and like defense of like rights and like recognition, representation in general, which is super like, we are humans. We love kind of like, doing things in group and like being advocated for oneself. But there's also a part that can kind of like be taken sometimes like very seriously. And I think it has to. Of course, it's important. And I think that's why, like in general, like any type of cause you need to kind of like stand for at work in terms of identity, in terms of like traits and like characteristics. I think it's really important to kind of like understand that you need to kind of like level the playing field. Like I think as part of this conversation today, we realized that a huge amount is linked to kind of like a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And the reason some employers don't take those necessary steps, it's usually not out of will, but out of like not knowing how. And I think it's unfortunately, and I think that's also a big debate, where does the responsibility sit? As you said, like for a startup that's just trying to grow, attract talent, generate revenue, have a product that actually like sells itself or like is attractive for the market. Digital things, they don't pop up on the radar because some of the founders just don't think about it. And I think it's our responsibility at least to kind of like ignite that spark. And of course, then there's a responsibility of trying to kind of like jump on the bandwagon and help one another.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I guess, leads me quite nicely onto one of my other questions, which is what misconceptions about neurodiversity have you seen in the workplace? And how have you, or how would you suggest other organizations kind of working towards dismantling these stereotypes? Because I think from my perspective, I'll be super open. When I thought of autism maybe 10 years ago, what that meant to me was essentially is a person who is very good at one thing. So whether it's mathematics, whether it's literature, like in school, it was just how I perceived autism, is like being really strong in one area. And it's so much more nuanced than that. And so I guess in your experience, what have you kind of seen?
I think it's I can't tell about like other types of like causes, but like for trying to advocate for neurodivergence, when I created that group at work less than 2 years ago, I realized like I assumed like everyone would come and have like ADHD because we are humans, we're biased, and even if I had done everything I could to just kind of like open up and be open-minded about it, I had no idea like so many people would join with like different types of like then there were like the specific learning difficulties, like people with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and it was so, because these people became my friends naturally. It really, like, you realize like how quick you can forge a bond. And I realized that basically like their strengths, but also like the stuff that were getting in the way of their productivity or their happiness at work was so different. For me, for example, like autism, I have ADHD and autism, so I summarize it as AUDHD, but basically like this merge of like ADHD and autism, it presents extremely differently in people, but also like has nothing to do with like kind of like what people like the Rain Man type of stereotype, right, of like autism. It's also kind of like one layer of diversity on top of another of like being like neuroatypical. And for me, that means like hypersensitivity to like sounds, lights, smells, glare. We had this new shiny office, which was really nice in London. Like everybody loved it, but it was right after COVID. Everybody was forced into the office at least 3 days a week, and I could tell how my group, like the neurodiverse people, the neurodivergent people at DICE, my former company, were really panicking because they were like, we're not being supported right now. Like we're actually forced into this office, which doesn't like is going to be hostile to some of us, you know. And fortunately, we found some ways to actually have like dedicated space that had like no sounds, like kind of like less, like more kind of like snug and cozy. And for people like us, it was so like empowering to know that we had been listened and that there was a safe space in the office. Yeah. And actually, you just had that question. I hope I'm not like I don't know exactly. What was the question originally? Like the misconceptions, right?
Yeah, basically about kind of any misconceptions that you've seen in the workplace and how we can kind of prevent misconceptions.
Actually, I think something that I've always wanted to share around is that not everyone is equal in terms of like the defense of their neurodivergence. There are people who are very well educated, who actually have been diagnosed. There's a whole topic, right, in the community about being diagnosed, not being diagnosed, but working with like the people in like the people team. At least in the UK, like you don't need to have like an official diagnosis to actually stand up for your what you think is right at work, especially at work. And like ADHD people can be seen as lazy, but like procrastinating, like distracted. But people sometimes ignore that there's like different types of ADHD, the same way there's different types of autism. And putting people on the box and what we call the medical paradigm, which is like putting labels on people, it's not the solution, especially at work, because at work it needs to be rooted into reality. Like what is preventing that person from achieving their true potential? And sometimes it's very small things, but I have an experience in my previous employment where someone I got really close to, I could tell like she had like, she was to me like, I felt like she basically had ADHD and we were talking about it, but I didn't want to kind of like tell her like you have ADHD. As soon as the group became kind of like more public in the workplace, I know she was kind of like more and more interested. And I tried to kind of like, you know, frame the conversation, and I realized that she was also kind of like asking herself like these same questions. The problem is that my experience in that workplace with my neurodivergence was very different from hers, because she was the receptionist, and she actually realized that she thought she was like depressed. She thought she was like she had all kinds of problems, but the actual problem was that she was in a space, and that her role had responsibilities that were so much for someone like her who didn't even knew her brain as much, because she had not been like having these conversations yet. So she actually like the whole time in employment, when I was at a company with her, like she actually realized that no, she wasn't going crazy, she wasn't being depressed, she wasn't just like all these problems. They didn't stem from like just like deeper things than just the fact that she was in the wrong environment to really like thrive. And it's because she was at reception, and can you imagine having ADHD, and every like 5 minutes there's someone interrupting you, asking you about something, you know, because you're literally like at the desk where everyone comes in and out. And she was losing her mind. And then actually I managed to talk to our manager, and we find out that there could have been ways, even with a role like this one, which was still like highly stimulating. It's something she loved doing, because she's ADHD people. Yes, okay, there's a form of distraction, etc., but there's also a form of also like being extremely social and enjoying novelty and all these kind of things. And like she was absolutely amazing at this, and she loved like putting together like a party for like the people at the office, and she could have been like the best employee. She was just like always like kind of some things were pushing her like really like above like her boundaries, and she felt like upset. And I've seen so many people cry and like feeling like feeling like it's their fault, when actually it's really a manner of like, it's a bit like saying like electricity is dangerous, we should never use electricity. But actually it's just about managing it and finding out like the ways to leverage it. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation if we couldn't manage electricity, right? So yeah, I think that's a long story, but basically that's what I've learned working with people who, you know, like they didn't trust themselves, and actually it's just about like finding the right setting to let them thrive, but it requires education as well.
Totally. I think, yeah, it's really fascinating as well, I think, where there are so many people who haven't been diagnosed. Hopefully we will see some more people being able to get through those huge long wait lists of finding stuff out. But
yeah,
I do think, yeah, it leaves you in a position where you do question yourself, you do question what's quote unquote wrong with you.
yeah.
Whereas it could be as simple as, yeah, making adjustments around
That's it.
a role that doesn't necessarily fit the criteria. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And I guess considering the sort of modern understanding of neurodivergence through anthropology and human evolution, what would you say, like, what insights can employers gain about the value of neurodiversity and bring those to the sort of technical landscape, as it were?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that book called Neurotribes. It's, I think, one of the best books when you try to kind of like, especially in tech. Like Neurotribes is written by this guy who in the early 2000s went on a cruise ship with tons of engineers from the Silicon Valley, and he started kind of like running an analysis on like how do these people think, you know, especially as they were like kind of like in the same place for a while, and he realized maybe there were patterns. Obviously, it was Silicon Valley in the early 2000s, so very like male dominated, unfortunately. But when you look at the Neurotribe, you're finding out that there's traces of neurodivergence since the as long as we can remember, and maybe it's actually also a reason why like some people were more ingenious, more curious, more took more risks, like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, and in Neurotribes he talks about Cavendish, like kind of like an English like scientist who didn't make so many waves at the time, but actually was like in advance in so many domains, like before actually like some of these innovations like became popular. So what I would say is in terms of like recognizing neurodiversity as a natural aspect of human variation, I think it should be a given, but often, unfortunately, it's harder to kind of like justify. It's a bit like telling to an employer like, oh, you should only hire like people who are like higher than, you know, 6'2", because like they are just more productive. But what you can realize is that it makes absolutely no sense. Like, why would we filter this way? And also, yeah, I don't want to do a point like Godwin, but like that's it's definitely not the way to go. I think it stems from the fact that people, anything that's kind of like medical or like linked to kind of like people's health and just kind of like biology, people tend to take extremely seriously. And obviously it's serious, but like they tend to overthink it. And if they haven't been like educated in the field of, yeah, this is just like actual like neurobiology, it's just like I have ADHD. And sometimes when I talk about ADHD, actually what I realize has worked best is that I give them just a quick explainer, a scientific explainer about how my brain works versus theirs. And usually it kind of like puts everyone like in agreement, because they suddenly, it's not about like mysticism, it's just about the fact that it's a bit like someone who, you know, is left-handed, you know, and all this kind of thing. It's a mix of nature and nurture. So I told them like, yeah, like I have ADHD, like my frontal lobe like doesn't generate as much dopamine as other people, so that means that my behavior compensates for that lack of dopamine. So that means I can get bored a lot, but that also means that I really struggle sometimes to focus on a single task. because that dopamine stops kind of like generating, you know. But also my brain is hooked on neuroadrenaline, a molecule responsible for the sense of novelty. So I'm someone who, if I don't take medication, is going to enjoy doing multiple projects at once, but it's really going to struggle like completing all of them. So, and then I tell them like how medication actually helps me cope and everything. And people actually understand like, okay, so it's basically it's the same way like you have diabetes and you can actually like manage your like blood glucose. It's a bit like that, you know. Obviously it's an oversimplification. I don't think everybody will agree with me, but I think you need to kind of like simplify the conversation for people who have no clue. And that's the way I try to do it. But no, it's not about, we shouldn't be shaming neurodiverse people and just because, you know, they haven't had a diagnosis. Like I feel like using medical ways to help people at work is not the only way. I don't think like it was a big topic in our group at DICE, like my previous employer, because so many people were unable to get a diagnosis and they didn't even feel comfortable seeking one, but they just love being surrounded by people who got them. And sometimes that was enough because they were actually able to cope. They just were super curious about their own like cognition. And yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really cool, that group that you started. Sounds like a really cool group to be part of. Did you have any sort of success stories? I mean, it sounds like that sort of group at DICE was kind of a success stories where there was integration of neurodiversity into the work culture. But did you have any others where it kind of resulted in some positive outcomes for the business itself?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think, so one of the success stories I love the most is really like this story with the person who was like working at reception, started at DICE without knowing anything about neurodivergence, really. Also, she comes from Ireland, and Ireland, like, it's not the same as the UK. Like, I come from France as well, and it's so impressive, the gaps, like only a few hundreds of kilometers away, you know, like between understanding of like neurodiversity here. I think also the fact that we're English speakers like helps a lot, but like still, anyway. And when she first started, like I got to know her on a personal level, and I wasn't really thinking about it too much. But as like the group kind of like had like a bigger voice, and like she started realizing, oh, maybe you guys can help me because like I'm really asking these questions to myself. And it was such a process to actually like let her have this conversation in a space that was psychologically safe with our manager. And actually, the reason I want to stress that story again is because one thing I didn't mention is that we had to work with the diversity, equity, and inclusion team to ensure like can we reach that point of like psychological safety, you know, in the workplace where that person is free to touch on the topic with their manager because without being afraid of repercussion. And it's really important when someone's been hired like to be a receptionist and to be available from 9 to 5, you know, and that really like that's the main kind of like success criteria for their role is like availability, brain space, head space during that time, you know, and like all the shifts being like it's not like I think I've worked in tech for a while now. Sometimes we kind of take for granted kind of like flexible schedules and like because we're telling everyone context switching is you know, it's not something we should be able to foster. But like actually I've realized for a role that was kind of like a bit further away from technology how difficult it was sometimes to have that conversation. Because like I was there like in the product team, you know, and I realized how much privilege I had because I was a white male being managed by a white male. And if I shouted a bit hard, like down the line, maybe someone would actually be, okay, that's fine. But actually, I realized that in that scenario, like my friend at reception was actually like, her hands were tied and she was like she was losing her mind, like really, like she had no way out and she felt like cornered. And fortunately, it was just a matter of like through indirect ways using the DEI team and the people team to actually foster what organizations sometimes underestimate, but actually like this kind of like line of reporting really nurture it in a sense that the manager had no idea what to do because she was also clueless, and the direct report had no idea either because it was the first time she was encountering that situation. So it's not a matter. Sometimes it's not even like the intention that matters. It's actually ensuring people are tooled. It's a bit like fire training at work. No one's been hired to actually handle like fire, right? But we need a few people to just be fire wardens because we have no choice. Well, it's a bit like this. It's like we need to have like a baseline, a foundation of actual like training to let people, like mental health first aiders are an amazing one in the UK, to just ensure that there's like a minimum of things to enable for these people.
Totally. And I guess talking of that, how important do you think education is within this conversation, having the access to that information, really?
Paramount, I think. I don't think there's another way. Like, I don't really see anyone kind of like, I don't know, like what would be the alternative? That's my question. Like fines, penalties, that's no. I think like the only way for neurodiversity and neurodivergence to really be accounted for in the workplace is to really like keep being consistent with our efforts in terms of advocacy and the voice. And I always try to be careful when mentioning like other communities, because we all have our own battles, and we need to be like every cause is different in terms of inclusion and hardship. But at DICE, at least, what I can tell what happened in my space. But like at DICE, we had these ECGs, so employee community groups, and we were the new kid on the block as part of the neurodivergent team. But funnily enough, we were also the most effective, I think, because we were extremely like diverse intellectually. So we always found ways to kind of like speak about ourselves. But like we worked with the BIPOC, so the people of color, Black and indigenous group at DICE, and we started doing like intersectional events. So we had like Black women, ADHD, black women with ADHD or neurodivergent Black women. We also had like groups of people who were, LGBTQIA plus and also like neurodivergent, and that's how we actually like try to kind of like propagate a voice that was just more than, there's this cause and that community and that community. Like we're women in tech, but we can also be neurodivergent. And we can be gay and etc. etc. And so I feel like really helping one another is really important, and also spreads it makes our voice like even more powerful. There's education on one end, but the problem with education is that you can put as many resources as you want out there. Like it doesn't mean people will, it's not like you will build it and people will come. Like that doesn't work like that. You need to, it's a fine equilibrium to reach, especially in the workplace, because people are we're in a capitalist society. People are hired to be to be rewarded and to be compensated, and their time is limited at work. The idea is to really create that culture and environment that lets people be even more curious and understand the value of documenting themselves, even having conversations. Like I think education is a heavy word because you think of like a big library or like tons of like articles to navigate, but sometimes education is just like at DICE, I've seen it, like it's grabbing a beer with someone who's still like new to the topic, and maybe happens to be a manager, and realize that a few weeks later they've actually like talked about that topic openly to the whole company because their kid is actually dyslexic. That's actually a real story at DICE. Like one of the senior leaders who was, like people were like, oh, she's the sales leader. She keeps signing contracts. Like she's very like, like the strong woman, really trying to go places like in her career. And actually, she took like an hour, 1 month to really like promote our group a bit out of the blue, I have to say. And I was like, I was gonna cry. Like I was like, what the fuck? Like this person just explained like her story with dyslexia and brought like everyone on board. And we had this kind of like neurodiversity Slack channel on DICE, which used to be like 12 of us, and then suddenly it was 73, you know. And it was like 10-20% of the company had been like had given us just a small sign that they were actually like caring about the topic. That was like, I think that's that day I realized that it wasn't just like it was much more than that, and there's much more potential, and like it's a continuous thing, and everyone can take part.
I agree. And do you think something like that, I was going to ask you about like decision making, how to bring neurodiverse employees into wider business decision making, and you've used a few examples, but what would you say is a good way to do that? Is it having more senior people listening and kind of being an advocate in themselves? What would you say?
I have a very I think a very good example I have is that there are already like neurodivergent people in positions of leadership, but you find several situations. You find people who are not sure if they're actually neurodivergent, but because they've been masking, because they don't want to think about it too much. I've seen that especially with male people, with men in tech. But I've worked for like 7 different companies in the past 10 years, and I've noticed that a lot of the co-founders and like CEOs I've worked with were usually neurodivergent. I mean, I'm not trying to put like maybe it's just a coincidence, but I was like, okay. And so I think the best way to kind of ensure that there's a fair participation and representation as part of like decision making in organizations, it's twofold. There's the existing people in positions of power. Like these people need to understand that valuing the opinion of a neurodivergent workforce or group of employees is only going to take them like it's just going to improve like the condition of their company, because if they position themselves as a diverse employer, they're going to attract more talent, you know, and they're also going to make a name for themselves. And we also talked about the value of that in like building products, but also like it's about creating a system and a network in the company to let these conversations happen. Unfortunately, like past I'd say like the 50 people mark or like 100 people mark, you need to have that. There's a need for hierarchy. It's just the way it is. It's about giving space to actually like it starts, I think, basically to summarize it starts with the culture. Like if you have a company that's growing, your culture needs to foster like the right environment for psychological safety, diversity of thought, and this type of things. Then there's a second layer, which is actually like allowing people to take initiatives linked to their culture. And that can be, for example, what DICE did in a very good way, these employee community groups, but also give them a framework to succeed. And that's why you need to hire like DEI people that are especially in the UK, there's amazing talent, amazing people like making a career out of that, and surround yourself and avoid to lean necessarily on like just textbook inclusivity. Like you need, I think having a in-house team or a trusted partner is really important. And then once these initiatives are taken, you need to embed them with your decision, your business logic, your decision process. And I think DICE was kind of like nearing this, but it was really hard to do because it's still like a new skill. So yeah, so working, I'd say like if your DEI team and your people team are able to kind of like work with one another a huge amount, that helps tons. Yeah. So I think that's what I've experienced so far on that topic.
Yeah, Absolutely. And my last question, otherwise we'd be here all day because I've got a million questions and follow-up questions.
Of course, no, thanks. Thanks for listening to me.
No, I love it. It's been really interesting. And as you have got like a lot of experience and you have worked in different companies, I guess what advice would you give at this point to employers who are at the beginning of their journey, kind of looping back to where we first started, towards embracing neurodiversity, especially when thinking about kind of demystifying neurodivergence and that sort of thing? What would you suggest from all your prior experience?
Well, it's an advice I'm giving to myself, because I joined Sienna, this AI company, only like less than 2 months ago, and before that it was at Dice, but I was laid off in summer, and like during that time I was actually looking for new employment. I ended up at Sienna, where we're still like quite small, and I'm in a position where I'm working extremely closely with the talent team, and I'm helping Andre, our CEO, shape actually what the company is going to look like. And I'm realizing that right now this decision is basically me and him, and ensuring that everything we do like sticks to kind of like a narrative of like inclusivity and being like an attractive employer, and retaining the talent as much as we can. And what I realize is that sometimes I think it's so easy for people to kind of differentiate, like there's me and there's them. But I think more often than they think, people are actually in a position of like influence. It's just a matter of like being confident that you can have that conversation. You can tell people, like you can repeat to people why it matters. And what I would say, at least for myself, in the case of Sienna, is that we're working on our culture right now. It's a bit the answer I was giving earlier. It's like I will ensure that culture from the get-go is not just about building AI products, like succeeding in a highly competitive environment, but it's also about our people. It's also about giving a chance to people from all backgrounds, and actually putting our money where our mouth is, and actually like allowing these people to join us through hiring processes that are more like that can be adapted. Something I started doing like last week was like on some of our tasks, it's written, if you need like reasonable adjustments, let us know. Like you can talk to our talent team if you need more time to actually like work on that task, if you have any impairments and all these kind of things. And I think it's that's the thing with like inclusivity, is that if you start like, if it benefits one part of the community, usually it's soon going to propagate to everyone, and that's what's super nice. And also this is the best way to differentiate yourself as an employer when you're starting, is actually to create that baseline of like, we're an inclusive employer, because you're gonna open so many doors. You're actually, it's a win-win situation, I think.
Yeah, and you need to be authentic with that as well, because it's
Absolutely.
super easy.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, like
it would be so easy to say, like, hey, we put that kind of like label on our website and whatever, and then it becomes how do you call it, like virtue signaling, right? Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think it's because it's so easy for me to say, as someone who's been in that, living in it for so long. But that's so true. Like, I think at the end of the actually, the best way is like, let the people who are like neurodiverse or neurodivergent in your company, if they want to like speak up and speak out. Like, I think sometimes a lot of people like refrain themselves because they don't know how to, and it's this olive branch we mentioned. Like, if you're sharing testimonies, if you're allowing people to disclose this information if they want to. When I interviewed for Sienna, like the first thing I said to my CEO is like, we were actually sitting in that coffee in London, and there was like, I didn't like the area where we were sitting, and I this guy I just met, who literally could give me a job or not. I told him, do you mind if we move on the other side of the restaurant, you know, like, and like and sit completely opposite, because I preferred like a different like area to just have knowing that I was going to have an important conversation. And I told him, sorry, I have ADHD, and it's really important for me to be in an environment where I can focus on what you're telling me. They said, oh, that's fine. Like, most of the people I've worked with who had ADHD, I've usually like done great things with them. And 3 months forward, we're working together, and it's working. It's working very well. So it's about that confidence, but no pressure though. Like everybody is on their journey, and you don't have to be a warrior for neurodiversity.
No.
You know, we already have enough on our minds, literally.
No, totally. I agree with that, and well done you for saying what you needed, because it isn't easy.
No,
when you're in a pressurized environment like that, and you don't want to say the wrong thing.
And it's not the only way. It's not the only way, but it's one way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Okay, perfect. And then I guess just to round off with this, how, if someone does want to continue this conversation with you or want to discuss the topic with you in more detail, how would be best to contact you or find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, but also my website is very simple to memorize. So my name is Thibault. So my website is thib.wtf. I managed to get that top level domain. So yeah, tib.wtf, or you can type my full name online and you'll find it. I'm also an ADHD coach. So at DICE, I was fortunate to be trained on like in coaching. And I use it for, you know, like regular coaching, but I've also specialized in like that person I was mentioning at reception. I'm coaching her now. I'm also coaching the person who's taken over from me at DICE as like the head of the Neurodivergent Minds group community. And it's been super amazing. Just it quickly turned into like reverse coaching and counseling. So yeah, so I'm also I do this like free of charge. So if people are interested, it's just a way for me to meet new people in the community and help one another.
Oh, that's so lovely. I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks so much for giving me a chance to talk about this. Like, it's the first time I actually talk about it to outside of work, and it's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that.
Thanks so much.